Welcome to Zero Shot Espresso, the show for AI engineers who are tired of building data pipelines. In this podcast, we talk to engineers and founders about deep systems engineering and the messy reality of data in the age of AI. My name is Jay, your host for the show. I'm co-founder of Daft, and we are building data systems to power AI products. Today, I'm excited to have Simon Eskildsen, founder and CEO at TurboPuffer, building serverless search systems for AI. Really excited today to have you on, Simon. So quick introduction of Simon. I'm very excited to have him on the pod. CEO, founder at TurboPuffer, previously at Shopify. I used to like to tell people that, hey, TurboPuffer is the best vector DB in the world that you've never heard of. But nowadays I can't say that anymore because everybody's been asking me about TurboPuffer. It's a good thing. It's a good thing. But yeah, welcome to the pod, Simon.
Thank you so much for having me, Jay.
Cool. Maybe just a quick introduction to folks who still haven't heard of TurboPuffer. What do you guys do? What's special? What's the special sauce?
We're the search engine you don't have to worry about. We build a search engine where we put everything on object storage, and it allows it to be super cost effective. And it's allowed our customers to build more ambitious version of their product. Customers like Cursor, where they used to index just a few thousand files in their code base, and now they index a lot more than that. Notion used to have an AI price tag on their plans, and we were part of helping them remove that and allowing them to also search third-party data. We also work with Anthropic, with Linear, Pylon, Grammarly, Clay, and many other companies, and just help them operationalize their unstructured data. Text and vectors is what we focus on searching.
Yeah, super cool. And it really feels like, TurboPuffer entered into this market almost like a second mover, I like to tell people. Like there was already so much buzz around RAG. And honestly, I was at an AI conference, I think 2023, and every database company was then a RAG or vector search company, right? How did you all think about it? And what was kind of that journey founding TurboPuffer and the thought process behind it when you first started out in this kind of like AI wave that was kind of, ongoing at the point?
Yeah, I think TurboPuffer did not start with now we spend a lot of time talking about the company, so you can say things that sound really smart, but at the time it was really not that smart. It was a summer project was what it was, where I had discovered through working with some of my friends at their company, and they wanted to put vector search in production, but it was going to cost them $30,000 a month. And this is like a small company. They're spending $4,000 a month their Postgres. We also couldn't do it on Postgres at any reasonable cost. And it's like, they just didn't ship the search feature not because it didn't work on small scale, not because it wasn't useful, but because the cost was holding them back. So it's the classic, in San Francisco, you all love to use Javon's paradox, right? Of you make gas 20% cheaper and you drive 40% more. And there's some non-linearity to that. And we've seen that play out in databases. We've seen that play out in many different areas. But it hadn't really played out in search. And so I think there was a general, I spent 10 years building infrastructure at Shopify before that. And at Shopify, I was part of migrating to the cloud, and it was always very difficult to keep the search cost sort of in line with what you felt the value was to the business. But there wasn't really any other alternative. So you didn't spend that much time thinking about it. You just paid the bill and cried a little bit. And I think that, but what really caught my attention was just didn't have a great experience with search at Shopify. And it was one of the most difficult things to get woken up by was when the search clusters had problems. And then again, right, with my friends at Readwise, where they were being held back in the product that they wanted to build. And doing my time off from Shopify, where I spent a couple of years sort of helping my friends' companies. And then my idle activity during that time was this project I called Napkin Math, where I write blog posts about if a computer can read RAM at 20 gigabytes per second, and you have this much data, you should be able to do this query in this much time. And so with that, combining the napkin math with the problem I saw of the cost was just sort of became a blog post for me. And so I wrote this blog post about, okay, well, you have all these vectors, they take up a lot of space, it's difficult to make them smaller, blah, blah, but what if you started on object storage? Can we make the economics work? And so I just worked through the napkin math. Okay, you have object storage cost 2 cents per gigabyte. It's slow, like 200 milliseconds P90. The block sizes are this. You can transfer at around 500 megabytes per second. And it's sort of I think maybe you could build a database where you just put everything on object storage and you cache it in NVMe SSDs because they're really fast, cache it in memory, and it would work really great for search. That was sort of just like all I just had in my head at the time. I wrote this blog post and I shared it with someone in the search base. I'm like, am I like off kilter? And that guy told me, you should just build this as a company. And so I just sat down and started building it in the summer of 2023. And it was really just a project. It just felt like this thing that had to exist. And the further I got into it, it felt inevitable that if I didn't do it, then someone else was going to do it. And then once it started feeling a bit more serious, I approached Justine, and I thought Justine was the best engineer who ever walked the halls of Shopify. And so she was just such a natural person to approach, to ask if she would come on board as my co-founder of TurboPuffer.
Yeah, super cool. But was there any point where, it started off as a project, but was there a point where you went like, this thing is like kind of taking a life of its own? I think we've heard from other podcasts about your kind of like journey through Cursor, obviously a big inflection point for the team and the company. But yeah, along the journey, like what was that journey like? Was there a point when you went like, I think this is actually gonna work?
Yeah, I think it was when we signed Notion, because Cursor was such a special customer. But the question for us was always like, how many of these workloads are there going to be? What does it look like? And AI is in such flux, and the market is really funny in the way that we buy software and we use software today, because we just don't know. We're all pushing at the edge. We're all pushing as fast as we can. And it was not completely clear how, I think that the initial sort of search and vector craze had worn off a little bit in 2024. And so we wanted to see if we could get repeat customers, right? What I know and love is to operate software at scale. And what I really wanted to do was to find a bunch of companies that we could learn from, of like, who are at the frontier of what's being done with connecting data to LLMs, and how can we help them and just make them feel like we are an extension of their team and one of the highest performing teams inside of their organization. How can we make them feel like that? And how can we work with the companies that are going to lead us to the product that everyone else is going to want down the line? And so Cursor was always felt like, oh, there's a business here. But when we signed Notion, it felt like, oh, there's maybe a really big business here. And that didn't happen until I'd been at it for a year.
Right. Yeah, super cool. I guess it's almost like y'all placed a bet on search as being one of the key kind of product categories that's going to be needed by almost every company now that AI is in the mix, right? It's almost as if in the past, search is like, like if you're an e-commerce player, if you're a knowledge base, maybe there's a search component that's critical to your product. But today, because AIs are searching all the time, it's maybe the bet that you place, and that's coming to fruition a little bit. Would you kind of like think about it that way?
I think now I think about it that way. I think that in 2024, it was just like, I was just writing the code that we needed to close the customers. I think I would agree that now, we talk about connecting data to AI. We know that we need, LLMs are sort of like the distillation, and they have the cognitive core, and they have to be connected to facts and all of that. Our understanding of how these systems are going to fit together, not just for me, but just as a community, I think has really gotten a lot more sophisticated over the past year. So the way that we also speak about our company has also gotten clearer. But it was always clear to me that, okay, well, it doesn't make sense to me that you can take all of the world's knowledge, compress it into a few terabytes of weights, and then you're just good. Like, it's not really like, it seems clear that there's going to be a pipe into something, right? Now we would call that maybe a tool call. And I think one of those somethings is going to be search over large amounts of unstructured data.
Yeah, 100%. Could you walk me through maybe like the message you started with in the evolution? Because now you call it search, right? At some point, I'm sure in there was like vector search. We're like, vector database. But what was that journey like for you?
It's actually a really good question. I'm trying to pull up Internet Archive right now to keep myself honest.
Pulling up the Wayback Machine? Yeah, that'd be super cool. I've done it for a couple of companies too.
And I think in the very beginning, the website was just markdown and bullet point lists. And I don't think there even was a slogan. There was just a list of facts. So I'm trying to see here. Okay, we're going here January 30th, 2024. So we've gotten the new design. The design now, if you go to turbopuffer.com, the design there that we're very proud of. And I
Yes. And
think
for those
back
on the
in
pod who don't know, I actually reached out to you and I was like, Simon, who's your designer? Like, I need to get in touch with this person because we're all daft in love with your design. It's so nice.
it said, okay, the title in January of 2024 was a truly serverless vector database. That's what it was. We didn't do full text search then or any of that. That's really what it was. And other than that, it will be a website that you very much will recognize. And I think that the messaging didn't switch over to search and search every byte until we launched full text search, which we did in the summer of last year.
Gotcha. Yeah, super cool. And so it's almost like you broadened the funnel of that. Yeah. The other thing that stands out to me about your website is the team page. You know, every time I go on there, I'm like, wow, this is a who's who of databases. I have no idea how you assembled this like super cracked. Like when people ask me, hey, which team is the best like systems, you know, people in the game right now? I usually point them to TurboPuffer. Yeah, walk me through the team. Like who's on there? Maybe some of the crazy stories of how, you know, y'all got to meet and actually bring some of these people on.
Yeah, the team is what I'm most proud of at TurboPuffer. We were just last week we were on we do a summit every 2 years. It's a remote, or sorry, not every 2 years, every twice a year. And last week we went to Mexico City and had everyone together there. And just for me to think about bringing all these people together, half of who I hadn't met because the team had doubled since we did the last one in the beginning of the year, is just like borderline tear-inducing for me. And I was sitting on the plane with our CFO Mike, and I was, of course, last minute working on the slides for the presentation the next day to go through with the team. And I was like, oh, maybe I should talk about the roadmap and so on. And this is like, well, what do you really care about? I was like, well, what I care the most about is just the team. And he's just like, you should talk about that. And so what I came up with was I basically it ended up being, I think, 2 or 3 hours. Like it was unbelievably long, where I just went through every single person on the team, how they ended up on the team, what I think that they are absolutely world-class at, and just how much we appreciate them. And I did that for every single person on the team, and also got their story of why did you join. And it was really fun. And I think the way that I think about our summits now is I would love for us to think about every summit as, well, there's no way that we could do that again at the scale that we're at now. And going through every single individual and spending, between 2 and 5 minutes on everyone, you can't do that again when you double by the next summit. And so that was really, really special to me. And I mean, we could go through some of the cast of characters, right? Boyan was the first engineer who joined the team after Justine and I. And Boyan and I met back in 2012, and we met in Italy when we were both in high school. And Boyan was on the North Macedonian team for IOI, which was the competition we were in Italy for. For those who don't know, IOI is the International Olympiad in Informatics. And it's a high school competition where every country has their own qualifier, and then they send the top, I think it's 4, maybe 6. I can't remember now for some reason. Of the kids in their own country, they send them to the team. As you can imagine, the American team is a lot better than the Danish team that I was on, but because it's the country is a lot smaller. But went there and became friends somehow with the North Macedonian team. And they just referred to Boyan as God. This is like 2012. And he just went by the nickname God. And of course, it was because Boyan has emerged out of the mountains of Macedonia with I think he was just a few points away from a silver medal in IMO and got a silver medal at IOI. So to North Macedonia, he's like on national TV. It was like he got out, he got to MIT. It's incredible. And we got reconnected almost 10 years later, well, more than 10 years later, and still had the old Facebook messages from back in 2012, 2013, wow. And got introduced by one of the co-founders of Modal, and they went to school together. I barely know how Boyan chose to bet on Justine and I, but he did as the first hire. And the second hire was Morgan, and Morgan Morgan and I met because he'd done a search startup, and while he was at Waterloo, University of Waterloo, he shut it down. I reached out to him because it was like early on TurboPuffer. We hit it off, and then 3 months later, when we had raised a little bit of capital, and we could afford to have some people on payroll, I reached back out to him, and Morgan was like, "Can I do a work trial where I just join for 2 weeks and feel out the vibes?" I'm pretty sure that was exactly his wording, and I love that. Like, it was like my wife told me, "Simon, that's exactly what you would do," and that's right. And we loved Morgan's vibe, and Morgan loved the vibe here. Then Xavier, I'd worked with at Shopify, and Nikhil and Nathan, like all of them have stories like this, and I think that was such an incredible way to spend an offsite.
No, that's amazing. Yeah, I think like the word you said there was they took a bet on you, right? And I think that speaks a lot to like the people that you bring in, that people are willing to take a bet on the team that's already there. And oftentimes as founders, that's kind of what our job is, to get someone else to take a bet and bring them on the journey with us, right?
And I think it's an enormous responsibility, and it bears weight into everything that we do, what we ask people to do, the hiring cadence that we do, the way that we show up in culture, the way that we fundraise. It's an enormous responsibility. And I think that it really has to be taken with, you have to be serious. It's a serious endeavor when you ask someone to come on and spend a lot of their most important currency of time.
100%. Yeah. Along those veins, I'm curious if you all have any have you all like formalized the culture, the vibe in the company, or is it still a vibe? You know, at like 20-ish, it's often still a vibe. But how do you think about what is TurboPuffer like to be in? If I were to come in for 2 weeks and scope it out.
I mean, maybe you should do that, Jay. Maybe you should come, because I think it's probably best. It's best. Yeah. What are you doing these days? Like, are you employable?
I don't know. Might be busy with my own startup, but not sure.
Anyway, I think culture is something that's extracted out of the air. It's not something that's decreed. And I do keep a list, and I try as best as I can that when people join, to book a meeting with them and then go through the list and tell the stories that we're also telling here as much as we can. And by telling them also internally, they'll be told by other people. But we have a list, and there's just like a big, you can imagine the construction signs that says work in progress. We have not decreed this, but there's some of these that we talk about externally. So to take some random examples from this list I have, we like correctness over simplicity over performance. So in some cases, we will choose simplicity over performance. For example, have everything on object storage rather than having another consensus layer is slower, but it's a lot simpler. And so we will always prioritize that, preaching to the altar of production. Another one we talk about is overstepping instead of understepping. I think my love language is someone looking at my PR, seeing my calendar for whatever reason, and then they just take over the PR, like push their commits, and then just merge it. That is my love language. And I think that in large companies, sometimes it's like, I should really talk to Alex about this. And it becomes a thing where you end up spending a lot of time chasing permission, and you end up setting up this graph of false dependencies to get anything done. And that was just not fun. And like P99s do not operate under that. P99s just want to do shit. And I think understepping is a really important value. And then the last one I'll give you is that any number should be a power of 2, or at the very least, divisible into a cache line of 64 bytes. And so you'll see that in our pricing. Yeah. You'll see that at our first offsite, or our third offsite, sorry. We went to Austin, and really what we needed to order was 5 pounds of beef. But 5 pounds of beef is such a bad vibes number that we, of course, ended up ordering 8, right? It's just a nicer number.
That's so funny. That's a great vibe. Actually, the other day, I know we were going through like, MQLs and SQLs, and the number 128 came up somewhere, and I was like, that's a great number. It's so funny how you all have kind of like formalized that.
It feels, to the P99, that's a nice number. 100 starts to feel like, okay, someone like sat in a spreadsheet, and 99 is like not a nice number. That's like you're trying to get me to buy something here that I don't need.
Yeah. That's so funny. Yeah, I'm super curious. Like, sometimes I talk to other founders and I ask them, hey, how do you run engineering? And one thing that comes up is this idea of rituals, like things that the team just like naturally started doing by itself. Maybe someone started a ritual and kind of, you all just took it and ran with it. And for some reason, you do it every Saturday now or something. Is there anything like that at TurboPuffer? I'm curious.
That's a really good question, Jay. No one's actually asked me that, but I think it's super important. I would say the heart of our company is the weekly. So every Monday, everyone meets and we go through things. And I think that the weekly is underrated. I've seen how a lot of startups run it, and they all run it roughly the same way, where you go through everyone's tasks. I think there's stages to what the weekly becomes, and the rituals also evolve as a result. The first stage of the weekly, in my opinion, is that the founders or whoever's in charge of product needs to just be able to contain everything that everyone is working on at all times. And in an early startup, it's just like, if someone works on the wrong thing for 2 months, like, it's a catastrophe. You really want to feel that every single one of your customers is using every single line of code. And so early on, we just had a bullet point list in Notion, and we just screen shared it, and we just went through it and tried to kill as much as we could, and all of that. Then at some point, we started putting the tasks into linear, because just having it in Notion, like at around 10 people, was too much.
And just to give people a sense of the size of, when you were doing the former versus latter, what was the number of people like in the room? When you transitioned?
We were doing the weeklies. I mean, when it was just Justine and I mean, we just chatted about it. When it was the four of us, we did it in Notion, and we just did everything as lists in Notion. And it was just like, this is what you're committing to this week. And there is little memory, and it was just week to week. At probably around 10, 12 people, Linear became a customer. I was like, okay, we should use Linear. And so we started using Linear for the task tracking, and then we still went through what everyone was working on. And I would say that at around 13, 14, the weeklies were becoming like an hour and a half, and it was a marathon. And most importantly, we saw that I wasn't changing anyone's weeks anymore. Like, there was too much context. And so then we went into this iteration that I haven't seen before, where we have a channel called priorities. And so in the priorities channel, at the beginning of every week, people are going to dump what they're going to do. And then me and the other people on the team will just go into the thread and be like, do you really need to work on this? Or like, do you have a lot on your plate? Should I take this from you? Or you have a lot on your plate. I think maybe you could prioritize this higher and punt this to next week. I talked to this customer, they really want this. Just doing that as a more distributed exercise. And now the weekly is more, hey, who are the big customers that are in the funnel? What are the key hires that we're working on? And then we go through red heart, yellow heart, and green heart activities at the company. And everyone feels free to add there, right? It could be a customer that's facing a particular problem, or it could be something to celebrate. It could be someone giving someone a compliment. And so the weekly has evolved, right, in format also, as it's not just engineers anymore.
Super cool. It's like really high agency, but at the same time gives, the people with context the ability to almost like nudge others in the right direction as needed.
Exactly. And I think it's just the overstep over understep, right? Yeah, I mean, you're in full control. And I think that whoever you report to is only second in charge of your own impact and growth, right? You are ultimately responsible. And a lot of that is choosing what to work on. And obviously in the beginning, as people join the company, we try to be more involved. But even for onboarding plans, I would love to be more involved than I am, but people just seem to hit the ground running.
Yeah, no, super cool. You all have really maintained that vibe of like being a really serious contender in industry, but then also just being like an engineer's dream, right? Like you're like putting out these like really cool numbers and blog posts and really, really, solid testimonials. And yeah, I guess personally for you, what still excites you in technology? I have a couple of questions here I wanted to ask you. So number one, object storage. Is there more? Like, are we already at peak S3? What's left for us to squeeze out of it in terms of this, like the napkin math, right? Does that change in 2026, I guess?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think, the way I think about it is like, okay, well, what really big database companies are going to get built as a result of a bunch of characteristics having evolved? And like, why is there a surge in databases that are built this way? And I think there's just three numbers that people should have in their head. One is NVMe SSDs came out in the clouds not until 2017-ish, maybe 16 in AWS and GCP, which meant that people just weren't really using NVMe SSDs outside of fairly specialized on-prem environments until then. And you certainly weren't designing a database from the ground up for NVMe SSDs, which is a database that is designed for very, very high concurrency to the disk and as few round trips as possible. That's how you get the most out of an NVMe SSD. So that was the first thing that had to happen. The second thing that had to happen was that S3, you want it to be consistent. It just makes a lot easier that you put something there or you override it and you read it and it's serializable, right? Like you see the result immediately, you read your own write. That S3 did not have that property until December of 2020. Mind-blowingly late, right? It was eventually consistent until then.
Yep.
And so to combat that, right, the first generation of databases built on object storage had a very big metadata layer that keeps track of what version and blah, 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 blah. I've never built a system like that, but I can imagine how much work it would be. And that metadata layer, if you talk to someone at, I'm sure at Snowflake or Databricks and other companies, it's really a beast. It has a lot of fantastic properties, but it's quite the thing to maintain. The third thing that had to happen, this didn't happen until December of last year, so only in the past year did S3 get the API of compare and swap, but Google had it before. And this API allows you to have metadata on object storage by, you put a metadata.json file there, you do some modifications to it, and you override it with a version, and you know that it hasn't been overridden. So now you've got these three really nice primitives that means that you can build a database that's different from all of the other databases. And so I think those are the main things that needed to happen for these object storage native databases, as I call them. And I think WarpStream was the first one of that generation. And when I launched, Richie, one of the founders, reached out and he's like, man, I call this blob homies. I don't think he ever said that, but we were building, right? And so I thought, okay, you could probably build a streaming business, right? You can build streaming platforms. There's a bunch of companies doing that now. And then the other thing is that there's a bunch of companies that are now building basic observability tools with this architecture.
Right.
So for example, one really interesting one, this is just one that I know the most of, is BrainStore at BrainTrust, where they use it to sort traces for for evals. And Ankur there, who's the CEO, I don't know how he has so much time to code. You should have him on the podcast. I have no idea, but he's always texting me about all this he's coding. I'm like, dude, don't you have stuff to sell? How do you have that much time to code? I was like, I have a sales team. What do you mean? Anyway, he's phenomenal, and a BrainStore, I think, is a great example of there's going to be databases built inside of companies for very specialized purposes, and this is a fantastic architecture of that. They'll be difficult to resell, but they will sort of make the perfect compromises for a particular business, which is what Ankur has done with his. The third business that you might be able to build on object storage, I think, is a search engine. I think it's a great entrance into the market. You've got I always say, to build a big database company, you need two things. You need a new storage architecture covered, and you need a new workload. Because if there's not a new workload, then people are not out shopping for a new database.
Yeah,
and if you want
100%.
to build a big database company, you need every single company in the world to use your database, either directly or indirectly. Directly, they're puffing directly, or indirectly, as in they're using Anthropic, they're using Cursor, they're using Notion, right, which is then using TurboPuffer, and ideally many times over. So I think that search felt like that for the reasons that we enumerated in the beginning of this episode. So it felt like a really good entrance into the market. But I think that any successful database company, and you'll see this with Mongo, you'll see it with Snowflake, you'll see it with Databricks, all the successful database companies, eventually ends up executing more or less any SQL query or query plan on its architecture with the compromises that makes. And so TurboPuffer's, way into the market was always vector search. Now we have great lexical search, and we will continue to do more and more queries in the order that is demanded from our customers.
Yeah, 100%. The follow-up question that this leads really well into what I wanted to ask later. When I think of search, right, I think of PageRank, which is not really like a database where a lot of people kind of have started from. Like, hey, we're building a database that does vectors and all that. PageRank it's an algorithm. It's an ongoing ETL process, right? How much do you think about that? Like PageRank style algorithms that are almost out of band, outside of the database, search-based algorithm that runs outside of maybe the main core engine that you all have built for the database.
Right. I'm gonna divide your question into two. So one is PageRank. PageRank is famously, of course, how Google build their search index. I don't think PageRank is useful today at all. It's completely gamed. But if you're building a search engine of the entire web, which by the way, some of our customers are doing, you can't use PageRank today. You need a way to bootstrap ranking, right? Because the holy grail of ranking is, of course, what humans are actually doing with the product. But in order to get there, you have to surface something that's ostensibly useful to get there. And so Google was basically bootstrapped with PageRank, but as far as I know, it's not a huge part of their signal anymore, if barely any, because it's so easy to
I heard
game.
it's at some point all like deep learning based, and God knows what they're doing now. But yeah,
I think so. Like PageRank is a way to bootstrap ranking good enough to then do the other things, right? And so how do you bootstrap it today? Well, you probably use LLMs as a judge is probably what I would imagine that you do. You just bit or lessen that stuff, right? So anyway, that's just PageRank. I just think that's an interesting point. It's only something I realized earlier this year.
I guess to paraphrase, you're saying that like there's a bootstrapping phase to almost like featureize the data first, so then you have features to work with that then you can build search on top of.
Yeah, if you're building at very large scale, that can really be that can really be very, very necessary. Because often when you build search systems, right, you get something crude. I like to think of it as you have a haystack. TurboPuffer's job is to grab the chunk of the haystack that has the needle in it, but that's still a bunch of hay that you're going to have to re-rank and run through some flops on a re-ranker, right? But at web scale, the only appropriate context to use that word in, that is just that chunk of hay, the needle could be enormous. So you need really good first stage and many, many stages of ranking. Anyway, to go back to your question of there's going to be other signals to ranking. And so one, of course, hard signal are filters, right? So you might say, I'm only interested in products that ship to Canada. I'm only interested in products that I actually have permission to view, right? Things like that, or I'm only interested in products that glob into this directory. Hard filters, right? So you navigate that. It's actually very difficult to do in a vector index, but that's one. Then there are the ranking filters, right? So, okay, well, I'm doing a text query and I'm searching for TurboPuffer, but you might want to weigh documents higher that that are of higher relevance. You might want to, if the document is also, I don't know, like has a banner image or something, I'm just thinking of Notion's use case, then you might want to rank it higher. And so TurboPuffer is shipping more and more of these signals. And probably by the time people listen to those, I think you can do both of the things that I just mentioned in TurboPuffer if you can't already. So those ranking signals are quite important. That's very different. That's a very solved problem to do for lexical search. It's very difficult to do for vector search. So there you end up sort of doing a higher top K and re-ranking on these things, or doing some kind of rank fusion, right? Where you're trying to rank across multiple different first stage retrieval tools.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. And then maybe the last question before we have to break is GPUs. You know, I think here as we're building Daft, we're keeping an eye out for what people are using GPUs for. One of the things that you mentioned actually is quite close to our heart, right? Hey, if you're featureizing a bunch of data, calculating these crude signals using LLMs, almost like labeling, that's one big use case. The other thing, I was wondering from your point of view, do you think GPUs are going to shake up the search industry? We saw NVIDIA releasing hardware level primitives for, say, like decompressing certain like Parquet specific like encodings. Seems like they're making a move there. What do you think? Is there a world in data and search where GPUs really start coming into the picture?
Yeah, I didn't know that they were doing that, by the way, like the Parquet instructions. That's really cool. I think the first thing I'd say is that whenever people talk about GPU, they also talk about scarcity, and that's a little bit scary to me. There's like a whole separate thing to manage. Not a reason not to use them for particular aspects, right? But that is a real problem that lots of companies have today. That you have to be aware of. So that's one thing that factors into the way we think about this. In terms of search itself, on the indexing path, you do a lot of matrix multiplications, basically, because you're constantly looking at like, okay, like which ones of these clusters are we closest to, things like that. It's probably possible that you can make that faster on the GPU, but we are not close to exhausting what a CPU can do here in terms of in terms of all the optimizations you can make. And they're very cheap if you can make them run sufficiently. And there's a lot to implementing vector search that will require cross-contamination between them. It's not a clear slam dunk for us. And then on the query side, it's really the same. It's much more around storage and things like that. And then it's about that. It's something we keep a very close eye on, 100%, but we have a lot that we can still do on the CPU side to get the most out of the machine that we run on.
Yeah, makes a ton of sense. And also, I guess you all are, on the retrieval side at least, very latency sensitive, right? Rather than being maybe throughput oriented, which maybe a GPU gives you more of, but latency at the end of the day is king. Cool. Yeah, just wondering if that was, about to change the napkin math at any point in time, but it seems like it's still, there's a lot more to squeeze out of the stuff we have today without worrying about that.
Yeah, there are two people on the team who spend more time thinking about this than I do. I'm pretty GPU is certainly a blind spot to me, so I've told the team that, and they know, so that's where they've done more napkin math than I have. But I think right now it's our calculation that it's not really worth it. We've seen some of the benchmarks of vector indexing on GPUs, and as far as we can see, we can beat it on CPUs right now with what we have
Amazing.
implemented.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me today. This was super fun. I learned a lot during the show. And yeah, I hope you had fun too. And hope to see you back maybe in a year. We'll revisit Where is Search in a year and do a little retro. That'd be really fun.
This was great, Jay. Your energy is contagious. It was so fun. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to this episode of Zero Shot Espresso. If you liked the episode, share it with another engineer who spends way too much time thinking about data systems in the age of AI. See you next time.